Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Good morning. Welcome to the DMZ, everyone. The temperatures have changed. It is a little bit chilly, rainy day here in your nation's capital.
It is apple picking season up here in northern DMZ. Where I am in Northampton, Mass, the leaves have not quite turned yet. If foliage is your thing, I believe the Yankee Magazine website keeps a real-time foliage map if you want to figure out what spots to hit. But usually, I'd say early mid-October is a good time for in my neck of the woods.
Let me say too, for tourists out there, if you would like to come to your nation's capital, do it now, because they eventually are going to have about 15 fences that will separate you from the White House and possibly a moat. And so, really what you should just do is fly into Reagan Airport. There'll be a cardboard cutout of the White House. Someone wrote about this. I'm stealing material here, but I go to Old Ebbitt Grill, which is a sort of famous local.
I've been there.
That's right. I don't know if we've been there together or we've talked about going there together.
No, we I went there actually. Back in the day, one of my deep dark secrets is I once volunteered for the Perot campaign in 1992, after he had his first dropout in July, those of us in the DC volunteer group met at the Old Ebbitt Grill to plot our future. that was the one time I was there.
Well, it hasn't changed, except that because I walk there, and it's a beautiful walk, and you go right by the White House. You can't drive down Pennsylvania Avenue anymore, but you could still walk down it. And I don't know how long it's going to last, Bill. I think they may be shutting that entire campus down eventually. And so come now. If you're coming to the nation's capital, the weather, it's rainy today, but it's a good time to visit. And, do it while you can, because, you may not be able to do it for long.
Now, one thing before we launch into our usual political conversation, I want to point out that I've been very disappointed in our viewership for never asking me in the thread about the poster that I've been sitting in front of. You can see the headline there is America Prepared. You might not be able to see in the fine print when a woman becomes president of the United States what happens to her poor husband when he becomes the first lady. And you probably can't see it all. You probably can't see it all what is under that, but you see a picture of Fred McMurray from My Three Sons wearing a flowery hat, and you almost certainly cannot see the person next to him, which is Polly Bergen. And Polly Bergen just passed away a few days ago at the age of 84. She portrayed the first female president of the United States in the 1960s era movie Kisses for My President. So that is the movie poster that is behind me.
Now, Fred McMurray, he's not. This isn't Uncle Charlie. This is like the good-looking dad, right? The sort
correct.
Ward Cleaver type guy,
right?
As I recall.
And they always, put upon, you humiliated dad. He's playing the same exact kind of role as the first male first lady in this movie, and I believe it's the first, media portrayal of a woman president. Has largely been forgotten to history, but
wouldn't it have been weird? Wouldn't it have been weird if Reagan had gotten that role? Because I feel like he may have been in the Charles McMurray space a little bit.
Right? No, he could have done that. That was in his wheelhouse. But people should. I believe you can get it on demand via YouTube. You have to pay a few bucks. But there's definite aspects of it which are hilariously sexist in retrospect, and there are elements of it that are not sexist. She's kind of like a Margaret Thatcher, badass president type. But the vast majority of the movie is about his trials and tribulations and not so much hers. So I think people should, as we have a historic presidential campaign, most likely in the offing with Hillary Clinton. It's interesting to watch Kisses for My President, honor Polly Bergen's memory, and see how far we've come in our portrayals of women in politics in the media.
Well, while we're talking about it, let's talk about it. Hillary Clinton, I saw something about a Clinton campaign aide following a reporter into a restroom. Additionally, this week, we've had the Bernie Sanders.
Did she go into the restroom, or was she outside the restroom?
I don't know. I was hoping you had read this story.
I thought she led her to the bathroom.
Okay.
But then waited outside. Maybe
that's it. So it's not like a Lyndon Johnson type situation there. Maybe more, and look, that's a sort of a mini scandal, like Obama saluting with the latte in his hand or whatever. But I think the Jim Webb story is maybe more interesting. Some people just dismiss him, but I actually think Jim Webb, and we've had the Bernie Sanders boomlet. We've talked about other,
There's a Bernie Sanders boomlet. When did that happen?
And it lasts for about 2 minutes, but we've had the Elizabeth Warren thing and whether or not she's going to run. But now I think Jim Webb, I argue potentially that Jim Webb is for real. But what do you think?
Jim Webb. Which is interesting about Webb is there's definitely a pocket of the left that is eager to have a primary of Hillary Clinton. A few of the pocket actually want to beat her. I think most of those folks don't see that as realistic and just want to put leftward pressure on her so she doesn't drift rightward throughout the entire campaign cycle, and to be able to show, look, there's a real robust left flank that you have to pay attention to and not forget about, regardless of what happens in the general election. So, the big fantasy is Elizabeth Warren. I've written how that's not going to happen. She's definitely not interested. I've written about how, Brian Schweitzer seems incapable of exploiting this because he says lots of, oddball things. I've questioned why the left isn't rallying around Bernie Sanders, because he is articulating the exact economic critique that these folks want to see pushed and want to make sure that Hillary is adopting it and not fighting against it. And they are nervous that she has tendencies to not embrace that populist economic critique. So Webb is interesting in that he does seem to share that critique. He also is sharing a more, I wouldn't say outright isolationist, but definitely a greater degree of skepticism to military intervention that some of these folks would also like to see, and what Bernie and Warren don't really articulate. They tend to sidestep those issues and keep the focus on their economic positions. So Webb, in a sense, is a 1-2 punch for that would go over well with that crowd. But he also has some decidedly conservative views or overtones when it comes to gender issues, when it comes to guns. Even when it comes to race, he seems to talk about how his Appalachian whites, get the short end of the stick a lot. And those kinds of things. I mean, I think he's even had some, borderline.
He doesn't have to talk about it. I mean, he has this sort of this working class Ed Schultz everyman vibe. You don't have to talk about it, but he rolls into Iowa or something.
You don't have to talk about it, but I think there's a campaign out there that's going to make sure you talk about it if he ever got any traction. So I just don't think it's going to get ignored.
I could see him doing, people dismiss him, and I could see. I think there is an element of Reagan Democrats, or whatever you want to call them, sort of blue collar folks out there, in places, in Iowa and Pennsylvania, and maybe in Ohio, and it does kind of cut into Hillary's base a little bit if you think about it. So I don't know. I think he poses an interesting threat to her in a different sort of way than, say, Warren or Schweitzer, who seem to be more sort of leftist sort of cosmopolitan type candidates, whereas
he in theory
more populist.
has broader reach than a Bernie or an Elizabeth. Bernie, clearly appeals, I think, almost solely to the left flank. People's aspirations of Elizabeth Warren is that she takes that populist critique and has the potential to give it broader reach because her personal story, her approach on the stump, doesn't come across as left-wing as maybe Bernie does. I mean, that's the hope that people have for her.
I think that's misguided. I think that in a general election, which, that's down the road, but I think that, look, Elizabeth Warren she certainly plays the populist card, but at the end of the day, an ultra-liberal female college professor, I don't see her being able to sort of seize that ground in a general election the way that someone like a Jim Webb could sort of do what Bill Clinton did and take those voters. I think what happened with Obama is I think that Romney didn't. I think Romney sort of depressed the turnout of the sort of working class white voters in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio. Like they probably should have come out and voted for him, but Romney wasn't the right guy. I think what Clinton did was actually win them. Obama didn't win them; they just stayed home. But Clinton won them, and I think Jim Webb potentially could win them. That's my gut. But what do you think?
Well, that's where I don't want to quibble too much about Warren and Obama in this discussion. Obviously, people on the left have a different attitude about their appeal to some of those constituencies. I mean, obviously, Obama did win. I mean, there's people who thought that Obama would have too narrow appeal in 2008 and 2012, and so he was sort of the beginning of the argument that yes, there is a way to articulate traditionally liberal rhetoric. Modernize it, update it, give it an extra dose of charisma, and you can make it sell outside of the deep blue states. I think people on the left see Warren as maybe someone who can do that and have a more pointed critique of Wall Street than even what Obama has done. But that's all theory because she's not going to do it. She's not going to road test the theory.
I don't know. I don't know if she's going to do it or not. But I think the real question that remains is, did it work just because Obama is special? There's something special about Obama, or can they replicate this? And
Obama, did jack up turnout amongst so-called rising American electorate, more youth, more minority. He did win over, I think, white working class in places like Ohio. After the auto bailout, he used that to his betterment. But obviously, there are other parts of the country. I mean, he does terrible in a lot of Appalachia. He couldn't win any of those states versus Hillary in the primary in 2008. He didn't compete for them seriously in either general election, and that's where Webb is from. So I take your point that on paper he could marry these constituencies and have general election edge, but it's harder to see how he even gets out of a primary to road test that theory because a lot of traditionally Democratic voters just aren't going to give him the time of day. And that's true for anybody going up against Hillary. So that it raises the question: would Webb be enticed into a third party race to see if he can have a center out type of campaign and cause some havoc in the general?
All right, well, that bores me. Okay, let's move on. I try to, I feel like we do need to cover both sides here.
Right.
But I'm more interested in the right, and I suspect the right's more interesting right now. Or maybe it's just me. I don't know if it's just me.
Well,
or not.
Well, I think it's tough because I mean, on one hand, both sides have their factions. But I think the Democratic side is more united right now, and I don't see a lot of oxygen for a Hillary challenger. We're talking about who's going to get 25% versus 10%. No one's talking seriously about someone who's actually going to overtake her. And whereas on the Republican side, you have the front runner in polls is consistently polling at about 15% because the whole thing is so diffuse. And there's also the fact that Republicans have a good chance of taking over the Senate, and that's going to put their friction in the spotlight very quickly. So I do there's more to chew on there right now, and I'm happy to chew on it.
Well, just to keep you up to date, Bill, as we talk here, Sarah Palin is in Kansas, campaigning for Pat Roberts, which I think is interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, we talked about Kansas last week. I don't want to go too deep into it right now, so I know we have a lot to talk about. But it's interesting that here you have a situation where a moderate Republican faction has openly broke with Governor Sam Brownback, and giving the Democratic challenger to him, a real shot of winning. And that has now spilled over into the Senate race because some of that same faction is backing the independent Greg Orman. The Democratic Senate candidate has dropped out. Orman's got a chance to consolidate the Democrats and the breakaway Republican faction. And Roberts' response to this is not to compete for those moderates.
Well,
is to try to run up the conservative base with people like Palin, and I mean it could work.
He brought in Bob Dole too.
He did bring in Bob Dole. I that's a legitimate point. Yeah. But the messages that they're saying, it's almost strictly Orman is in league with Obama and Reid.
I think that's probably true. And by the way, Mike Mimley from the LA Times tweets, Palin in Independence, Kansas says Greg Orman isn't truly independent. He's, quote, trying to schnooker you.
Right.
So that's her message right now.
You're not seeing Roberts make a case that he can work across the aisle. That's not the Roberts argument. The Roberts argument is you want a Republican Senate to stop Obama. Again, it could work. I'm not saying it can't work, but I think it's a pretty... It doesn't strike me as the logical move when you have this breakaway faction that is mad at Brownback for being too hard right and is calling for more bipartisanship, and Roberts is kind of thumbing his nose at that and thinking he can run up the score with the base. It doesn't seem to be the strategy that a lot of other contested Republican Senate candidates are taking. A lot of those guys are blurring the ideological lines a lot more, and Roberts really isn't.
It is interesting, and I don't know enough about it. I need to talk to some of my people. I do have some Kansas sources to find out the ins and the outs, the nuances, but we'll keep an eye on that one. I do want to switch topics real quick, Bill. We don't have to save this one till the end. I do want to talk about Bill Simmons.
Okay.
Because as you know, I am a rabid consumer of podcasts. I not only do I have a podcast, but I listen to podcasts. I listen to Tony Kornheiser's radio show and podcast. I listen to Adam Carolla. I listen to Econ Talk. I listen to a ton of podcasts, Fresh Air, you name it. And one of the podcasts that I like a lot is the BS Report, which is Bill Simmons' show at ESPN. And on Tuesday's show, I think I actually listened to this one. I think it was a show with Cousin Sal, who is Jimmy Kimmel's cousin, who comes on, and they sort of pick the games or the point spreads. And Bill Simmons, who started Grantland, and who's a noted sports columnist, called Roger Goodell a liar. And for that, ESPN has suspended him. I think it's for 3 weeks. Whatever it is, he got a harsher suspension than the original Ray Rice suspension for punching and knocking out his then fiancée. So anyway, I found this fascinating for a variety of reasons. I mean, I'm a Bill Simmons fan. I really like his podcast. And I admire, I try to look to like innovators and interesting people in other fields like sports, entertainment, whatever. what can I learn from them? And Bill Simmons is one of those guys that I try to, not only enjoy the sports talk, but also like, how can I replicate some of his success in a different realm? Twitter has been, I think, universally in favor of Bill Simmons and against ESPN. But I mean, the obvious problem is that ESPN is a partner with the NFL, things like Monday Night Football, and they, on one hand, you have the desire to do good journalism and to have opinionators be free to say what they think. On the other hand, you have this cozy business relationship where the NFL provides a lot of revenue and access to the NFL. Like if the NFL said, we're not talking to ESPN anymore, we're going to limit access, that would have a huge challenge to their bottom line. And anyway, I couldn't help but think about Bill, think about this. What would I have to do or say to get a suspension from my job?
Well, your job, I mean, it's not quite apples and apples, because your job is to make opinions. I mean, you write opinions.
But that's Bill Simmons' job too.
I mean, look. ESPN can run its business the way it wants to run its business, and people can choose to like it or not like it with their remote controls. I wonder what the average ESPN viewer expects out of ESPN. Do they really look at ESPN as a outfit of journalism, or do they look at it as a place to watch sports and have people talk about sports? So if you're ESPN,
okay, but I agree. But let me just say, first of all, the thing that I like about Bill Simmons, and this is a podcast. This wasn't on air. This wasn't on cable. This was on his podcast. And the reason I listen to him is because he doesn't bullshit you. I mean, despite the fact it's called the BS Report, it's going to be like he's going to tell you the truth. But listen to what ESPN's statement said. Every employee must be accountable to ESPN, and those engaged in our editorial operations must also operate within ESPN's journalistic standards. We have worked hard to ensure that our recent NFL coverage has met that criteria. Bill Simmons did not meet these obligations in a recent podcast, and as a result, we have suspended him for 3 weeks. Okay, how is saying that that Roger Goodell, that if he says he didn't see the tape or whatever, that he's lying? That's a bad journalistic standard? That I don't know.
I mean, I don't know what ESPN means by their journalistic standards. I have no idea what those are. I mean, it is not.
Apparently, it's sucking up to the NFL. And,
I mean, that may well be what it means.
Their propaganda.
Right.
That's their journalistic standards. But think about what we do, Bill. I mean, look, I agree with you. I mean, I always defend private companies' right to do what they want, to be stupid or whatever, and you don't have to work for them. But think about the sort of the chilling effect. I mean, imagine if Mitt Romney or Chris Christie or Rand Paul called my boss and criticized me for saying that they lied about something. And then imagine my boss suspending me because I went on my podcast and said, I think Ted Cruz lied here, or I think Chris Christie lied here. That would be an affront to journalism and to, again, sports aren't as important as politics. I don't know. There's something about this bothers me greatly.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying, I don't mean to sound like I'm being a giant cheerleader for ESPN. I really could care less about ESPN. I'm just trying to think through the topic. But what I suspect is sticking in your craw and other people's craw, maybe a little subconsciously, is plenty of people on ESPN give bombastic opinions all the time. Whether a player is good or not. There's
not just that, but there was a commentator, I think, on ESPN who was sort of pondering whether or not some of these women maybe have it coming. Maybe they were provoking them. And they got a shorter suspension than Bill Simmons got for, I think, being completely within the bounds of his purview on a podcast It's not even on air. I mean, I make a distinction there. Maybe they don't. But I feel like we have to vigorously defend the ability for journalists, and especially people who are specifically known to do opinion, right? Not just straight reporters, to do that and to speak truth to power and to say the emperor has no clothes on. And if they're going to be penalized for daring to criticize, I mean, again, what if my boss said, you know what, Matt, we need the RNC, we need the Republican Party to like us because they give us access. And if we want to go to the convention and if we want Reince Priebus to return our calls, then by God, you can't say anything bad about him. I would be morally offended by that. And I could never imagine that happening. Never imagine that happening. And I'm sure that stuff happens.
But it would be an issue if your job is to cover something, and then you're saying in a separate forum that you fundamentally disbelieve or dislike the subject you are covering. I could see a journalistic outlet saying, you know what, you should not be covering these people anymore because you have put too much of your opinion on your sleeve. The consumer is not going to trust you to do a fair job covering the story anymore.
No, that's a fair point. That's similar to Dave Weigel at the Washington Post. One of the things initially that got him in trouble was saying, of all the people I cover on the right, or of all the people I cover, I respect them all except for the anti-gay marriage bigots, right? And he was going to cover like the values voters, the Family Research Council or something, their events. It would be hard to cover their events fairly if you have come out and said that you think that anybody who opposes gay marriage is a bigot. So I think you're right about that.
But there's other outlets that would like an opinionated reporter to be an aggressive reporter, to assume the worst and do hard-hitting stuff, and some people that might happily consume that. I mean, it's the question of what is your journalistic vision?
Yeah.
Are you clear with the public what that is, and you're holding your team to similar standards? And I get the sense that ESPN's not applying a consistent standard here, because I'm sure there's lots of people who have reported on folks who have said critical things about their sportsmanship and not suffered any consequence.
Well,
at
and
all.
the other thing too, Bill, is it's just in a way perpetuates the narrative. I mean, now you always think of ESPN and the NFL as being one and the same. It's like a wholly owned subsidiary of the NFL. And if you look at the missteps that the NFL has made, and just the barrage of problems that Adrian Peterson, Ray Rice, it's a never-ending, cavalcade of criminals and thugs. And then you look at Roger Goodell and his mishandling. There's apparently, I saw a story the other day that apparently Frank Luntz was advising Goodell, and then he went on a Fox show and didn't really fully disclose that when he was talking about how good Goodell's speech was. So you have not only the players representing the NFL in a not so great way, but you have Goodell and the NFL operations really doing a poor job. And then you have the ESPN do this, which I think was like an overreach. It's one bad move after another. That's what it seems like.
This sort of raises the question for me that I don't know the answer to. What is the average sports news consumer expecting out of these sports outlets? I would think over the course of history, you have not turned on ESPN or opened the sports section of your paper looking for hard-hitting investigative journalism of the sport. You're looking for the scores. You're looking to see, predictions, who's going to win the next game. This is fun. This is an escape. This is myth making, and that's what you're paying for.
Those are the fact that we've had. I mean, those are the old days. Now it is
right. That's what is it changing?
Yeah.
Is there a shift in expectation after steroids? After these domestic violence situations, are people now, do they want their ESPN to be digging into this stuff now? Or are there other people like, look, I really just wanted to see the game, so stop bothering me with this. I don't know what the average I'm not a sports guy anymore, so I just don't know what people think.
Well, no, look, in the old days, what they delivered was the scores, right? But now that's easy. Anybody can Google at any moment and find out who won the game last night, and who won the NL East, right? So just the scores and like what happened in the third inning, that there's really not as much of a market for that because that information's so easily obtainable, and so I don't know that there's a big market for investigative reporting either, but I do think that what there is a market for is commentary, smart commentary, and analysis, and things that happened off the field, right? So if you're watching, like, Pardon the Interruption, it doesn't even have to be Outside the Lines, which specifically is about outside the lines. But if you're listening to Tony Kornheiser's radio show, as I do, for example, it's not like, hey, man, on during the third quarter, RG3 should have thrown a pass and he handed it off to Morris. Like, that's boring, right? I mean, that's not what they talk about. What they talk about is, like, what is Coach Jay Gruden? Is there an emerging feud? And is there going to be a quarterback controversy? Like, what happens when RG3 comes back and let's say Kirk Cousins is actually won his next 3 or 4 games? Will there be a quarterback? So it's a lot of sort of gossip and soap opera-y stuff. And that's really why you're listening, right? And so the reason I listened to Bill Simmons' radio show, so, for example, he has this segment where I think this happened. If my memory serves, it's Cousin Sal, who is Jimmy Kimmel's cousin, and he comes on, and they actually guess the point spread, and they sort of bet each other who will come closer. So it's like, I think the Redskins are going to win by 3.5 points over, but what's the official line? So it's a little game they play, right? But you're having these guys who are very irreverent, who are, sort of just a couple of guys sitting around maybe drinking a beer, bullshitting each other. And they're, at one point, he goes off on this rant on Roger Goodell. And it maybe lasted for 15 seconds or something. But, like, that's why you listen, is to really have these guys to really understand what they believe and what they feel. And I think Bill Simmons is a personality. He's this guy from Boston. He's got, he has a certain shtick that I think that people like. If you like him, some people hate him. But if you start sort of censoring what he can say and what he can't say, his entire brand is contingent on him telling the truth and sort of being irreverent. And so that's part of what I don't like about this.
I mean, didn't we just have Keith Olbermann? He's on Fox Sports now, is that right?
I don't know. I will say whatever he's on. And by the way, this is maybe the unspoken thing, right? ESPN is no longer the only show in town. They have Fox Sports, right, which is emerging as a potential, competitor. But I don't know where Keith Olbermann is. But I will say I saw it on the internet. He did a really good piece on how putting Derek Jeter in context. How Derek Jeter, everybody in sort of our generation and younger sees him as like the greatest Yankee ever. And Keith Olbermann sort of pointed out, if you look at a whole bunch of statistics, he's like the 12th or 13th greatest Yankee. He ranks in many, behind a lot of other Yankee greats. And I thought that was really good. And I'm sure he got a lot of.
Well, that's what I was leading to. I mean, it was a brutal takedown.
Brutal, partly
Jeter,
because it was done with logic and facts. It wasn't just ad hominem attacks.
Well, I thought certain things were a little ad hominem there, I gotta say. I'm sorry, he's on ESPN too. Okay. He's ESPN.
Well, see that
So why does the ESPN say you can't cover the Yankees?
Right, exactly. You
are not qualified to cover the Yankees because you are being unfair to Derek Jeter.
Because the ESPN apparently is the untouchable propaganda, wholly owned subsidiary or whatever. I mean, that clearly, right? You could certainly say that Keith Olbermann crossed the line. And by the way, let me just say, the fact that neither of us knew where he was, and yet both of us had seen that clip, is in and of itself telling of the state of television today, of how we have personalities, and it doesn't matter as much where you're writing or what network you're on. I mean, again, this is a podcast that Bill Simmons does. I listen to it on iTunes. You know, I don't watch him on ESPN. I don't even know if he's on ESPN.
But to go back to the Oberman thing for a second, I thought the whole thing ended sort of weirdly when he says, basically, after this whole statistical, brutal takedown of where he stands in baseball history, he then says he would impress Oberman. He would sort of like wash away the entire criticism if he chose to retire after the last Yankee home game as opposed to the last regular season game at Fenway Park.
Right.
And I was just kind of like, who cares when the day you retire? What sort of testament of integrity does that give you? Really broken to play out the end of the season, even though the games don't matter.
He had an argument for why there was precedent in doing that, but I completely agree with you. That was an overreach, and frankly, that speaks to what conservatives have always hated about Keith Olbermann, is that that's the kind of thing that he would do to twist the knife in people he doesn't like if they were on the other side of the political spectrum. And I thought that was a bridge too far and really apropos of nothing. However, 80% of that segment, which lasted about 10 minutes, I mean, that's part of the reason it was brutal, I thought was really good. Because here you have a guy who's being counterintuitive. I mean, everybody else is like, giving wet kisses to Derek Jeter, the captain, oh captain, they're doing these really touching, there's a really touching Gatorade, I think it's a Gatorade video, it's in black and white with Derek Jeter. I mean, I hate the Yankees, and even I had something in my eye watching this. So, I mean, there's a lot of nostalgia, there's a lot of love for Derek Jeter, and that's what, like, it's like almost politically incorrect to criticize Derek Jeter. And so that's what I liked about Olbermann, who was taking the exact opposite, counterintuitive point and saying, yes, Derek Jeter is a great baseball player, but he's not even in the top 10 greatest Yankees, and I can prove it to you. And he went about doing exactly that. I thought that was good journalism. I agree. He takes it a little too far, and that's why we hate Keith. That's why we hate Keith Olbermann. He's a dick. Let's be honest. But in this case, good journalism.
But he's not being suspended.
Look, I'm telling you, I don't know what I would have to do or say to get suspended. I am fortunate. I feel like I am blessed to work at a place that has my back, and I don't know what I would have to do or say. Now, part of it is that I would say this: anything that would get me fired, I don't think I would say anyway. You know what I mean? I think that I would hopefully check myself and not wreck myself. But the notion, look, Bill, I mean, I'm not going to name any names, but you and I, look, I've written things and then phone calls have been made. And it's usually a bad idea. You're not, going over, you should not try to go over a journalist's head. But I can specifically say that it's probably not a good move for you, Bill Scher, not you, Bill Scher, but for others. Like, don't even try, because eventually what happens if you have a media outlet that you can work the refs on, you write something bad about this candidate and they call up the boss and then you retract it, or, you're not going to be a very interesting outlet for very long, are you? We have to be free to take shots at people, who deserve it. And have diversity of opinion. Like this is a liberal thing, Bill. I'm defending diversity of opinion and free expression, and and the right, even the right to be wrong. The right to be a jerk. The Bill Simmons thing really does hit home with me, as I think you can see. I mean, I'm passionate about this.
Well, let me see if I can get you fired before we're done here, though. So you have been following the case of Ted Cruz, still a potential 2016 presidential candidate, after he had this seemingly a bit of a stunt move addressing a Middle Eastern Christian conference, and then attacking the crowd for not being supportive of Israel and getting booed and then kind of reveling in the scorn he was reaping at this event, and some other conservative columnists. I saw Ross Douthat's piece on this. I haven't seen others, but I saw Douthat had said, this guy Cruz was not being very helpful to the plight of persecuted Middle Eastern Christians, who can't be seen as hugging Israel if they're going to be able to make their case in their regions, because obviously Israel is extremely controversial in that part of the world, and Cruz was not being very sensitive to the nuances of the region.
Yeah, I think Douthat's piece in the New York Times is probably the quintessential piece on this issue. If you haven't read it, it was I think it was about 2 Sundays ago. It was New York Times column, and he nailed it. But look, you had in the audience here, you had Middle Eastern Christians who are being persecuted, who are being martyred, some of whom live in places where, if it gets back to Assad, let's say, that they're in a room clapping about Israel being like the greatest, or about Assad being attacked, let's say, that maybe isn't good news for them. Some of them probably feel like Israel hasn't been the best friend to them. So whatever the reason,
I mean, there are Palestinian Christians who are not very happy with Israel for legitimate reasons.
Maybe they're part of the crossfire or what, whatever. So whatever the case may be, Cruz's, and I understand what, Cruz's comments, he goes in there and he starts talking up Israel and stuff. And honestly, my gut is that I've interviewed several people all sort of on background who were I was not at the conference. I've talked to several people who were. And, there was, some of the people in the audience, I'm willing to guess there were some anti-Semites in the audience. I'm also willing to guess there were some people who just disagreed with, the notion that Israel is the best friend of Middle Eastern Christians. And if you watch the tape, Cruz goes out and he starts saying good things about Israel, and at first there's applause. And then he says more things about Israel, and then there's applause. And then he says something, and there are a couple of boos. And I think eventually some of the people who were booing were really booing him, the sense that he was pandering or playing politics at a conference that was about them and about unity. And anyway, he ends up saying, like, if you will not stand with Israel, I will not stand with you, and walking off the stage. And that was the original story a few weeks ago, and of course it has advanced since then.
So Cruz now has so he took his swipe at conservative columnists, suggesting that they had an interest in perpetuating an anti-Israel narrative.
Well, yeah, he gave an interview to World Magazine, which is a respected Christian media outlet or magazine, and he was asked during the interview, he was asked multiple questions about this incident. Makes sense that they would ask him about it, and eventually he said, like, it is interesting that a lot of the columnists who criticized me haven't really written a lot about the plight of Middle East Christians until now, and it makes me wonder about their motivations. I'm paraphrasing, but he was essentially implying that that people like Ross Douthat and Molly Hemingway and potentially me and others, Michael Brendan Dougherty and several of our colleagues at the Week were anti-Semites.
Did you take it as a personal attack on you? Did you think he was thinking about you when he said that?
No, I didn't think it was about me. Just because I wasn't one of the most outspoken critics of his. I wrote like one blog post, and I think there were others who were a lot harsher. Some of our colleagues at the Week were much harsher in their condemnation of him, and people like Ross Douthat have a much broader reach than I do, being at the New York Times. So I think he was thinking of them, not me. But the truth is that most of them have written, several of them have written quite frequently and eloquently about the plight of Middle East Christians. So that was factually wrong. And he ended up, I think because of my story, because I called him out on this. Now, interestingly, I had written a very glowing piece about Ted Cruz yesterday morning in the week about how his foreign policy is Reagan-esque. And then I stumbled upon this, and he ended up issuing an apology of sorts. It was a mistake to suggest that critics of my remarks at IDC had not spoken out previously concerning the persecution of Christians. Many of them have done so, often quite eloquently. It was not my intent to impugn anyone's integrity, and I apologize to any columnist who took offense. He goes on to talk about the plight of Middle East Christians.
Has Ted Cruz apologized to anybody for anything in his entire life? Is this the first known Ted Cruz apology we have seen?
Maybe not the last, but well, first of all, let's a couple things. Is this an apology? He says, let's see. I apologize to any columnist who took offense. So that's not I apologize for what for being.
That's maybe not apology.
Yeah. So this is like a George Costanza. Maybe wouldn't accept this if this was part of a 12-step program to make amends. Right. This may not qualify, but I'm going to say it. I'm going to accept it as an apology. And let me just say this:
it's the closest he's come to an apology in his political career.
I think it's a good sign, like for him, that he quickly backpedaled on this, and I think acknowledged that it was a mistake to imply what he implied. And I think it's a good sign for him because look. Politicians are going to mess up. They're going to have gaffes. They're going to say bad things if they run for president, and I think he's going to run for president. And the fact that they handled this the way they did, I think implies if it's not humbleness, then it's at least political wisdom. So I give him kudos for doing this.
So you don't think he has he successfully contained the damage of this? He hasn't burned his bridge with conservative media over this subject, you don't think?
I mean, I think there was a chance that this thing could have blown up, that this story could have become huge, and it really didn't. It did not blow up.
Okay.
And I think that you could, maybe it wasn't gonna, or maybe it's because he tamped it down, but either way, crisis averted.
Now, I want to get into this foreign policy question because you had this Syrian vote in Congress that was attached to the bill to keep the government open, which was a provision that endorsed increased funding and training of the Syrian rebels who are not aligned with ISIL. This seemed to be a bit of a watershed moment in clarifying the foreign policy fault lines, really in both parties. You had a handful of prominent Democrats that voted against this too, including Mark Begich, who is running for a tough re-election for his Alaskan Senate seat. Warren and Sanders, who some on the left have been critical of not being anti-war enough. And gliding past those issues, being very sympathetic to Israel, for example, on their attack of Hamas recently, now siding against Obama on this question. You had Rand Paul very dramatically lambasting the entire strategy after, really kind of bobbing and weaving on this subject for the last, several weeks, now coming very firmly against, he seems to say, I'm okay bombing ISIS, or ISIL, however you want to characterize it. I'm okay with bombing them, but I'm not okay with getting more directly involved in the Syrian civil war and siding with a faction over Assad. That seems to be where he's drawing his red line. He's sort of separating out ISIS
being
from. That's
maybe not the right word, the right term to use here, but I'll take it. Look, here's my bottom line is, in the last decade or so, you've had two different foreign policy worldviews. You had George Bush's adventurism, nation building, which I think was well-intentioned but disastrous, let's be honest. And then you had Barack Obama's leading from behind, don't do stupid stuff. I would say dithering. I would say impotence. You would disagree, but let me just. So Bill, is is playing this game in protest. But so anyway, that's my take. Is the one guy who's learned from both of these mistakes is Ted Cruz, and I think that the positions he staked out is a third way. I argue it's a Reagan-esque way, but he's the only guy who's really learned. I mean, look, Marco Rubio. I love Marco Rubio's rhetoric about about the morality of free markets and about the American dream and about how America has to be a beacon of hope. Nobody does that better than Rubio. But at the end of the day, could I see him doing what Bush did? And yeah, I could totally see the potential for Marco. I don't know that Marco Rubio has learned the lessons from George W. Bush as much as I sort of respect. And
he's taken a very pro-intervention stance, and he has pretty consistently, I think, throughout the last 2 years.
And I respect and admire that, and like I say, that I think that George W. Bush, that it was very well intentioned, and I'm susceptible to being a little bit caught up in what could be called utopianism, in the sense about they're going to be everybody deserves a chance to be free. And George W. Bush talked about this all the time. About how Saddam Hussein was this horrible dictator, and he was, and about how there are all these great Iraqis who just want a chance for freedom. And you know what? Not really. I mean, I hate to be, Peter Beinart at The Atlantic, that's what spawned me to write this. He criticized Cruz as being a militaristic pessimist. And I think in a dangerous world, maybe that's a good place to be. Maybe being a pessimist isn't so bad. From the signing of the Magna Carta, which I think was 1215, it took Western civilization hundreds of years to get to a position. We went through the Glorious Revolution. We had our own revolution. We had our own Civil War bill. There were so many things that had to happen before we were capable of having the institutions and the political institutions and the political culture to have liberal democracy, that it is a bit naive to think that we can go to other folks and just thrust upon them democracy. And so I think I am cynical now. I think I am more skeptical, and I think Cruz is more skeptical now. And I argue maybe that's a good thing.
Well, this is where I'm glad that this debate is going to be had. You were hard on Peter Beinart, who treated Cruz's foreign policy as calling it militaristic pessimism, and essentially calling it very oversimplified and knee-jerk. And you're making the counter case that this is a thoughtful third-way response to the failures of Bush and Obama. I definitely side more with Beinart here than you, because it strikes me that we shouldn't be oversimplifying any of this. This is just all very complicated stuff. I think there are definitely lessons to be drawn from what we have seen so far from both Bush and Obama. But I think we also should acknowledge where there have been successes and where things are incomplete and situations are fluid. We don't know whether things are working out well or not. I mean, as you point out, there's a long stretch of time between ratifying the Magna Carta and seeing democracy bloom. There's a long stretch of time between Woodrow Wilson pushing for the League of Nations and then having a United Nations and then seeing decolonization happen after that and seeing a realization of what Wilson's vision was. So does that mean that Wilson was wrong to push the League of Nations because it couldn't happen in a day? Or did you need someone to, plant the flag, plant the seed, and push and accelerate what might not have happened organically, or it might have taken a much, much longer time if it was left to organic forces? These are hard things to definitively prove or disprove.
Yeah, and let me just say this as an aside. I don't even necessarily like talking about foreign policy because I'm not an expert on foreign policy. But you know what? The so-called experts get it wrong. They get it wrong all the time. And so I feel like you weigh into these debates. Frankly, I trust my gut better than I trust some of the best and brightest who go on TV And I'm not going to mention any names, but I think we know the people who are on TV all the time. Saber rattling, for example, whatever.
But my concern with both Cruz and Paul here is I feel like they're reacting very superficially to events and not appreciating how interconnected all these events are. And you basically both Cruz and Paul are saying I'm okay bombing ISIS. I think Cruz is going and correct me if I'm wrong, but they both are being more skeptical about helping the Syrian rebels otherwise. Now, I'm not saying that is at the end of the day definitively wrong, but it does strike me as hard to separate out the issues because, I mean, once in for a penny, in for a pound. Once you're bombing ISIS, you are affecting the broader region. You're affecting everything that's going on in Syria, and you're affecting everything that's going on in Iraq. Not to mention how it affects the peripheral nations of Iran and Israel. I mean, so you need to have a foreign policy that recognizes, okay, if I do, action X, what does it mean for everything around that situation? And I need to have, and I at least need to think through, do I need complementary policies to deal with the ramifications and consequence of the act I'm taking?
Well, so what I would say to that is, I think you're right. I mean, bombing has consequences. Using drones has consequences. You anger people, you create enemies, you hit the wrong guy, and now his whole family hates you for eternity. I think though, you got a couple extremes. Like one extreme is you do nothing, and I think that's unacceptable. And then I think the other extreme is where you have this really utopian, fantastical notion that you can go in and win hearts and minds and build school, and just dramatically transform the Middle East. And that's why I think what Cruz is really arguing is a middle ground. It's a modest, prudent foreign policy which says we will kill the bad guys, knowing that there may be some repercussions, but we go into that knowing that, but without any sort of quixotic notions about them liking us for having done this. And so, look, as Obama says, we live in a messy world, and I believe we live in a fallen world. And in a way, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I'm just saying, I think of many bad options, I think that what Cruz is generally advocating is the most prudent.
Well, I'll give you the last word.
I like it that way.
We're pushing in hours.
I like the last word. This was a good talk, and thank you for indulging my Bill Simmons talk, which obviously I was passionate about. So,
it's an important subject.
And if I get suspended from this show, it could happen. The Blogging Heads folks, I would love a 3-week
free invite to Bill Simmons if he's looking for work. He needs a place to hang out and speak his mind. You can always come to the DMZ. Yeah. It's a safe zone.
A 3-week paid vacation would be nice. Just keep me on the payroll. That's all I ask.
Well, till next week.
You got it.
It's Bill Scher. People should go to the Daily Caller where Matt Lewis hangs out. They did a whole refurbishing of the website. Looks very snazzy.
Thank you. Looks good. Still working out the kinks, but looks good. Check us out on Twitter at DMZ Show, on Facebook.com/DMZ Show, and we'll see you back here next week right here. See ya.
Take care.